Case 1. The Sodder Children Disappearance, Fayetteville, West Virginia, Christmas Eve, 1945. In a town still catching its breath after the end of World War II, the Sodder family home lit up the hillside, not with holiday joy, but with fire. At 1 a.m., smoke poured from the two-story frame house. Inside were 10 children. By the time George and Jenny Sodder realized the flames were spreading, it was already too late. They rushed through the smoke, grabbing children in armfuls, shouting names, smashing windows. In the end, only 4 children made it out alive. 5 of them, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, just 5, were gone. Not one body, not one sound, just silence. The fire burned fast and hard. When the local volunteer fire department arrived, hours after being called, the house had already collapsed into glowing ash. Chief F.J. Morris and his crew sifted through the ruins as the sun rose, but found no trace of the 5 missing children. By December 26th, a coroner's jury was convened. 4 days later, the state issued 5 death certificates citing the likely cause as heat or suffocation. No forensic testing was conducted. No remains were cataloged. The official story was that the children had died in the fire, but their parents never believed it. And as the facts began to stack up, the official version seemed less and less plausible. Chief Morris later admitted he had quietly gathered what he thought were bone fragments and buried them without analysis. The family's telephone line hadn't burned. It had been cut. The ladder George always kept by the side of the house for emergencies had vanished, only to be found tossed in a nearby ditch days later. A man named Lonnie Johnson confessed to stealing a block and chain from the property that night and cutting the line, but denied knowing anything about the fire or the missing children. Add to that the family's claims of hearing something crash onto the roof just before the fire started, and the list of oddities grew long quickly. Still, the investigation labeled the fire an accident, no charges, no follow-up. In 1949, unwilling to let the case fade, George Sodder hired a private investigator and began excavating the site himself. Among the ashes, he found vertebrae, small, intact bones. They were sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where forensic analysis concluded that the bones belonged to someone no younger than 17. The oldest missing Sodder child was only 14. The bones also showed no signs of thermal damage. If the children had died in the fire, the bones would have been charred or crumbled. These were clean, intact, undisturbed by flame. The findings didn't just cast doubt on the original verdict, they opened a door the authorities had long since shut. In the years that followed, tips poured in from across the country. A woman claimed to have seen the children staring out from the back seat of a passing car while the fire raged behind them. Another claimed to have seen them at a Charleston motel the next day. Letters arrived. Rumors spread. Then, 2 decades later, an envelope showed up in the Sodder mailbox. Inside was a photo of a young man who looked strikingly like Louis, now grown. On the back, a cryptic message. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys, A90132 or 35. There was no return address, no explanation. The family hired another investigator to follow the lead. He vanished and was never heard from again. George and Jenny turned their pain into protest. They erected a billboard along Route 16 with the children's photographs and a plea for answers. It stayed there for decades, becoming an icon of both grief and defiance. Jenny, dressed in black every day for the rest of her life, planted flowers in the exact spot where her home had stood. She never moved, never gave up. George died in 1969. Heartbroken and still searching. Jenny followed in 1989. Their surviving children kept the case alive, long after the world moved on. No arrests have ever been made. No forensic testing, no DNA analysis, no CODIS hit, no STR-mix modeling has ever been applied publicly to the evidence. Modern genealogical tools that have closed hundreds of cold cases remain unused here. In the eyes of law enforcement, the case is officially closed. But in the eyes of the family, and many in the community, it remains painfully open. Some believe the children died that night. Others are certain they were taken. but nearly 8 decades later, no one has proven either. All that's left are fading photographs, unanswered letters, and 5 names lost in the fire's smoke. If the answers still exist, they may not be buried in ash, but waiting in unopened files, untapped databases, or DNA that's never been tested. The real mystery isn't just what happened to the Sodder children. It's why, all these years later, no one has truly looked. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with "I am still here." Let's see who is still watching. Case 2. The Mothman Sightings, 1966-67. It started like a rumor, fleeting, unbelievable, and hard to hold on to. But in the fall of 1966, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, became the center of something it could not explain. On November 15th, 2 young couples were driving near an abandoned munitions plant, the ruins of a World War II TNT storage site now overtaken by trees. As they rounded a bend, their headlights caught something in the dark. It stood in the road, 7 feet tall, with wide wings and eyes glowing red. When they drove away, it flew after them. Within days, others came forward. A man digging a grave near Clendenin claimed he'd seen a massive figure rise from the trees. A local contractor and his wife said it landed on their roof. 2 volunteer firefighters reported what they described as a large bird with red eyes. Sightings poured in, each eerily consistent. This was not just one misidentification or late-night tale. Dozens of people described the same impossible creature. Newspapers dubbed it the Mothman, and the name took hold. What began as a single event spiraled into a town-wide panic. By December, the reports had multiplied. Residents called police, journalists, and each other. Eyewitness accounts came from all corners of the county: fishermen, teenagers, law enforcement, even a deputy sheriff. But without any physical evidence, law enforcement could only document the statements. Police Chief W.E. Mills coordinated interviews but emphasized caution. There was no crime, no physical threat, and no jurisdictional precedent. The sightings, while alarming, were treated as oddities, not as emergencies. Behind the scenes, anxiety grew. Strange phone calls were reported, anonymous voices warning locals to stop talking. Some described them as flat-toned and emotionless. Others claimed they were threatened directly. Whether prank, hoax, or something else, the calls deepened the paranoia. And then, just over a year after the first sighting, everything stopped. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed. Built in 1928, it had carried U.S. Route 35 traffic across the Ohio River for nearly 4 decades. That evening, during peak rush hour, it gave way without warning. 31 vehicles fell into the icy water below. 46 people lost their lives. It remains one of the worst bridge disasters in American history. The collapse stunned the region, and it ended the Mothman sightings as abruptly as they had begun. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the cause was structural failure. A single eye-bar in the suspension chain had fractured due to long-term stress and corrosion. The weight of traffic, combined with the brittle failure of outdated steel, brought the bridge down. There was no mention of any creature, no tie to folklore. The report was detailed, engineering-focused, and final. But for Point Pleasant, the question lingered. Why had the sighting stopped on the exact day of the collapse? No forensic samples were ever collected. No physical trace of the creature was ever recovered. No bodies, no footprints, nothing to measure, test, or compare. In the eyes of science, the Mothman remained a ghost, unverifiable and undocumented. But for the people who saw it, the memory was real. And for the families who lost loved ones on the bridge, the tragedy remains raw. Journalist John Keel, who arrived in 1967 to investigate, would later document the events in his book, The Mothman Prophecies. He didn't claim the creature caused the collapse, but he believed the timing was no coincidence. His work inspired documentaries, fiction films, and academic theories. Still, no official agency ever revisited the phenomenon. No university launched a field study. No investigative team set up motion sensors or cameras near the TNT area. The story was archived. Left in the hands of folklore. And yet, Point Pleasant remembers. Each year, the town hosts the Mothman Festival, welcoming thousands of tourists and believers. There's a statue in the town square, a museum packed with newspaper clippings, photos, and eyewitness sketches. The creature has become an icon, part mystery, part cautionary tale. For some, it represents fear. For others, it's a warning, a symbol of something just out of reach, too strange to classify, too consistent to ignore. The case remains unexamined, not just by scientists, but by the systems we rely on to explain the unexplainable. It wasn't a criminal act. There were no charges, no courts, and no suspects. But what it left behind, fear, grief, confusion, felt every bit as real. Perhaps the Mothman never existed, or perhaps we still don't know how to see it. What we do know is this. In the year leading up to one of West Virginia's deadliest disasters, dozens of people said they saw the same thing. They couldn't all be lying. They couldn't all be wrong. And just because the system couldn't prosecute it, doesn't mean it wasn't there. Case 3. The Murder of Sister Roberta Elam, 1977. It was meant to be a place of peace, a hilltop sanctuary in Wheeling, West Virginia, where silence was sacred and stillness was part of the practice. But on June 13, 1977, that silence was broken. Sister Roberta Robin Elam, 26 years old, had been spending the week on a private retreat at the convent of the Sisters of St. Joseph. It was her time for reflection, 8 days away from the noise of the world, surrounded by woods, faith, and trust. That morning, she left the convent building and walked the familiar trail that wound into the hillside behind the property. She never returned. Hours later, the worry set in. She wasn't one to stray. Staff and fellow sisters began a quiet search, calling out her name, retracing her steps through the narrow trails. Then, on a quiet slope not far from the convent's edge, they found her. The scene was disturbing. Her clothing had been disturbed, and there were signs she had been overpowered. Investigators would later confirm that she had sustained life-threatening injuries, and what happened to her was not an accident. It was an attack, a deliberate one, and whoever was responsible had vanished into the forest without leaving a sound. The Ohio County Sheriff's Office quickly took the lead. They were soon joined by the West Virginia State Police, forming a joint investigation to handle the sensitive case. Interviews were conducted with staff, caretakers, and anyone with routine access to the grounds. The area was searched thoroughly. Nothing else was found. No weapon, no clear trail. But the case did yield something rare for the time: forensic evidence. A biological sample was collected from the scene, an unknown male DNA profile. It was a critical piece of evidence. But in 1977, there were no databases to compare it to, no national registries, and no forensic genealogy. The science wouldn't exist for decades. In the weeks that followed, investigators pursued every available lead. They reconstructed Sister Roberta's final hours, reviewed her schedule, and examined the layout of the convent grounds. Nothing pointed to an insider. She had no known enemies, no personal conflicts, no threats. She was quiet, kind, deeply committed to her faith. It seemed impossible to believe someone would target her intentionally. Yet someone had. Deputies canvassed nearby properties, interviewed laborers, visitors, and delivery drivers. A local groundskeeper was questioned and cleared. Another man, whose name was never formally released, allegedly confessed to the crime years later, but authorities were never able to verify the claim. No charges were filed. As the case grew colder, the limitations of the era became more evident. Chain of custody protocols in the 1970s were less formalized, and case files from that time were often incomplete or inconsistently archived. The convent's remote location and the absence of surveillance made the investigation even harder. With no eyewitnesses and no viable suspects, the file went dormant. And yet, the evidence never went away. That DNA profile remained preserved, sitting in a lab vault, waiting for the day technology might catch up. Decades later, that day nearly arrived. As forensic genealogy tools began closing cases across the country, investigators reviewed Sister Roberta's file. The profile was still viable, and while no public report has confirmed that it has been submitted to genealogical databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, the case has been reevaluated in light of these new methods. Unlike so many unsolved cases from that time, this one has the one element most cold cases don't: a preserved genetic clue. But despite this, no name has been connected to the sample. No arrest, no warrant, no breakthrough. What lingers is not just the question of who, but how. How could such an attack happen in a place so protected? How could someone slip in, commit such a crime, and vanish without anyone seeing or hearing a thing? Sister Roberta wasn't walking through an alley or an isolated parking lot. She was walking through a spiritual refuge, and that violation of space, of trust, of sacred ground, still reverberates today. Every year, the Sisters of St. Joseph quietly honor her memory. They don't hold press conferences or public events, but they haven't forgotten. The convent still marks the anniversary. Residents in Wheeling remember the case, especially those who lived through that summer. Newspaper articles resurface every few years. The sheriff's office keeps the file open. A reward remains posted, but the silence remains louder than the answers. Sister Roberta's story isn't just about an unsolved case. It's about a missed opportunity, for closure, for justice, for peace. It's about the tension between faith and fear, between safety and reality. Her life was one of service and discipline, and the violence that ended it has gone unanswered for nearly 50 years. This is not a case frozen in time. It's a case waiting for the right key. The question is whether that key is buried in someone's memory, or already resting in a database no one's checked. Until then, her story remains a quiet storm, still circling the hills of Wheeling, waiting for the truth to be named. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe, and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. Case 4. The Murder of Irene Wilson, 1963. It was a quiet stretch of land, dense with trees, light on neighbors, and far from the watchful eyes of any passing car. In the remote community of Broomstick, tucked deep in Calhoun County, West Virginia, isolation wasn't unusual. Most people preferred it that way. But in 1963, that same solitude concealed a crime that would haunt the area for generations. Irene Wilson, a 52-year-old wife and longtime resident of the county, was found in her home with injuries so severe that even the most hardened deputies struggled to process what they saw. It began with silence. Irene's phone rang unanswered. A neighbor, unable to reach her, agreed to stop by the house, a single-story structure set back along a dirt path. What they walked into would later be described by one deputy as the kind of thing that sticks with you, even decades later. Irene had been attacked inside her own home. She was unresponsive, with signs of overwhelming force. Authorities would later document more than 50 separate wounds. It wasn't just a loss of life. It was personal, purposeful, and whoever did it had time and rage. The Calhoun County Sheriff's Office responded immediately, with assistance from the West Virginia State Police. Investigators interviewed Irene's husband, who had been working the night shift as a security guard miles away. His alibi was confirmed by his employer, and no evidence at the time tied him directly to the scene. Still, in such a small, rural place, proximity bred suspicion. Some neighbors quietly speculated. Others defended him, calling him a man broken by what he walked into. He passed away just months later, carrying unanswered questions with him. The early investigation was thorough for its time. Deputies canvassed the area and questioned anyone who had reason to be near the property in the hours before the discovery. But Broomstick was a place where few strangers passed through. The idea of a random intruder seemed unlikely. No signs of forced entry were noted, and nothing of value appeared missing. Whoever came into that house either knew Irene or knew how to move without leaving a trace. At a time when law enforcement tools were limited to fingerprints, photographs, and written notes, there was only so much they could do. What made things worse was the landscape itself. The property was remote, surrounded by woods and long gaps between homes. No streetlights, no surveillance, and no immediate witnesses. The violent nature of the crime raised serious alarms, but there were no footprints outside, no tire tracks noted in records, no sound reported by nearby residents. In an area where dogs bark at every unfamiliar car, this attacker left no echo. Despite its severity, the case quickly ran out of leads. There was no viable suspect, no weapon recovered, and in the absence of modern forensic tools like DNA comparison or lab-based reconstruction, the trail grew cold fast. Chain of custody standards in rural counties during the 1960s were inconsistent, meaning it's unclear whether any physical evidence from that scene still exists today, or whether it was preserved in a way that could be re-examined. The decades that followed brought no answers. The case remained technically open, but unofficially dormant. Every so often, reporters from nearby counties would revisit the story. Local columns published on anniversaries still recall the terrible summer when fear settled over Broomstick. Some call it the worst unsolved case in county history. Others have tried to move on, but the memory lingers, and while no suspect was ever charged, the emotional impact remains sharp. The violence itself, so focused, so excessive, suggests a personal motive. Yet the lack of a witness or clear pattern prevents any definitive theory. Was Irene the target of long-harbored resentment? Or was it a moment of opportunity seized by someone hiding in plain sight? The questions remain exactly where they've always been, just out of reach. What makes this case especially frustrating today is that we live in an era when cold cases far older than Irene's have been solved through forensic genealogy. DNA pulled from old slides, decades-old fingerprints enhanced through new technology. These methods are closing cases every month across the country. But for Irene Wilson, there's no public record of DNA testing, STR mix modeling, or any genealogy-based inquiry. Her case has yet to receive the benefit of what science now offers. In Broomstick, the house is long gone. The path is still there, overgrown and quiet. Locals still point to where it once stood. Some speak of the case with curiosity. Others change the subject. There are no surviving children to push for new leads, but there are still neighbors who remember Irene. Kind, soft-spoken, and gentle. The fact that someone took her life in such a way remains a wound on the community's conscience. The story of Irene Wilson is not just a crime story. It's a snapshot of what gets lost when the world moves too slowly. It is a case that deserves a second look, not just for the sake of history, but because somewhere, buried in a forgotten file or untouched lab report, there may still be an answer. Case 5. The death of Danny Casolaro. He told his family he was about to bring back the head of the octopus. He said he was closing in on the story of his career, one that would expose corruption at the highest levels of government, finance, and international espionage. Then, just days later, Danny Casolaro was found unresponsive in a hotel bathtub in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Danny Casolaro was not a household name, but in the early 1990s, among journalists chasing the shadowy corridors of government secrecy, he was a known figure. A freelance investigative writer with no corporate backing or newsroom shield, he'd spent years threading together what he believed was a single, interconnected system of corruption, spanning arms deals, banking scandals, software theft, and covert operations. He called it the octopus. It was his theory of everything. He believed it linked the Inslaw software theft scandal, the collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, and the Iran-Contra affair. And somewhere deep within this web, he was convinced, was a secret that someone would kill to protect. In August of 1991, Casolaro told multiple friends and family members that he was traveling to West Virginia to meet a key informant. He was excited, nervous, but energized. He checked into room 517 at the Sheraton Inn in Martinsburg. Just days later, on August 10th, a hotel maid discovered his body in the bathtub. His arms bore multiple deep cuts. There were towels on the floor, a bottle of wine on the table, and a few personal items arranged neatly. But what was missing were the most important things: his briefcase, his research notes, and most of the documentation that had driven his years-long investigation. Local authorities from the Martinsburg City Police Department arrived first. They processed the scene, noting no signs of forced entry or visible struggle in the room. The cause of death was quickly classified as a self-inflicted act. The state medical examiner's office agreed, but the people who knew Danny best, his brother, his friends, even some of his sources, refused to believe it. Not because of blind faith, but because the evidence didn't make sense. Danny had a lifelong fear of blood. He was meticulous about his work, protective of his files. Why would he travel hundreds of miles to meet a confidential source, check into a hotel, and then suddenly choose to end his life, just as he claimed he was nearing a breakthrough? Over the following weeks, the investigation drew in multiple agencies. Detectives from the Martinsburg Police, representatives from the Department of Justice, and eventually, members of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee all became involved. More than 1,000 hours were logged by investigators. They interviewed hotel staff, pored over his calls, and tried to piece together a timeline. The official findings remained consistent. Danny Casolaro had ended his own life. But for others, especially independent researchers and his family, the story had too many cracks. One of the most disturbing questions centered on the wounds. Official reports stated that Danny had made over a dozen cuts. Some were deep, others more superficial. But medical professionals and even investigators quietly noted the difficulty of making so many cuts to oneself without hesitation or passing out. More troubling was the complete absence of his briefcase, the very item he guarded obsessively. No one ever found it. His notes, which included years of interviews, leads, and diagrams connecting dozens of powerful entities, were gone. These were materials he never traveled without. The case began to fracture under scrutiny. A journalist uncovered that handwritten police notes from the original scene contained inconsistencies. Some mentioned that Danny's behavior was upbeat in the days before his death. Others hinted at missing evidence. Documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act later revealed that federal agencies had sealed several internal memos related to the case. One memo, leaked years later, suggested that a high-level official had pushed to close the investigation prematurely. Whether that was due to genuine belief in the ruling or to avoid deeper inquiry remains unknown. As years passed, the case entered the realm of conspiracy lore. Danny Casolaro became a symbol, not just of a mysterious death, but of the dangers faced by those who chase stories too far into the shadows. His theory of the octopus took on new life in independent documentaries, podcasts, and books. Netflix's recent docuseries, American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders, reintroduced the story to a global audience. It didn't offer a neat resolution, but it reopened public scrutiny of the investigation and the systems that may have failed him. Despite renewed interest, no official breakthrough has occurred. There has been no arrest, no charges filed, and no recovered documents. What remains is an eerie silence, one that surrounds Room 517, and the secrets that may have died with Danny Casolaro. The Martinsburg Police Department, when asked, maintains the case was thoroughly investigated. The Department of Justice stands by its conclusion, but independent researchers argue that what Danny was pursuing, the fusion of intelligence, criminal enterprise, and government contracts, was far too dangerous to leave uncovered. The question then becomes, was this a tragic case of a man overwhelmed by obsession, or a silencing meant to protect something larger? Casolaro's family continues to push for answers. His brother has gone on record multiple times, stating firmly that Danny was not in a state of mind to end his own life. Friends have recounted how Danny warned them that if anything ever happened to him, it would not be by his own hand. These warnings weren't vague. They were specific, repeated, and, in hindsight, haunting. There are no easy answers in this case. That's what makes it so compelling and so chilling. Every piece of missing evidence, every sealed document, every redacted memo adds to the uncertainty. Even more than 30 years later, the story of Danny Casolaro continues to disturb those who believe in the power of investigative journalism. It stands as a cautionary tale. What happens when one man tries to peel back the layers of a system designed to remain in the dark? For the town of Martinsburg, the event left a quiet scar. The Sheraton has since changed names, and most of the local authorities who handled the case have retired or passed on. But for those who remember the summer of 1991, the image of that room and the man found inside it remains frozen in time. Danny Casolaro came to West Virginia looking for answers. Instead, he became a question no one has been able to answer. Thank you for your incredible support. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered?